Chapter 2, Spring of a Memorable Graduation Year. I spent last summer with Cheesy after a brief visit with my father. It was supposed to be a 7-day week with my dear old dad, but it turned into a 4-day week, and I still felt like I got there a day early and stayed a day too long. My father was anxious to leave for Macau with the Duchess. At least he called her the Duchess. I don't know if she was really anything more than someone with more money than taste and a bigger yacht than him. She wasn't a terribly bad person, just spoiled by her money, making her seem self-centered. It had been a typical dad vacation, but I was making the best of it. After all, the accommodations were primo, and Dad was busy working on an opportunity to improve his lot in life with the Duchess. The Duchess obviously had wealth based on her behavior and demeanor, and was a lady who was used to getting what she wanted. At that moment in time, she wanted to go to Macau and Dad was ready to lift anchor. That gave me the opportunity to visit with Cheesy for the rest of the summer. I jumped on a plane to Marseille to meet up with him. He had given me a phone number to call when I got to the airport, and he sent a car to pick me up. The tiny car zipped through back alleys, barely wide enough to squeeze through at any speed. The car finally came to a rest in a courtyard where Cheesy was waiting with the bikes he had purchased for us. The plan was to drive the French Riviera, stopping at beaches, hotels, and casinos along the way. The French Riviera was the part of the world Cheesy knew best and called home. He'd grown up on this strip of highway, and most of the casino management along this strip knew Cheesy, and more importantly his family. That limited any gambling we planned to do, but gambling wasn't really a lot of fun with Cheesy because it wasn't really gambling. Our focus changed to beaches, bars, and hotels. There was no better tour guide than Cheesy for this strip of highway. The motorcycles were Yamaha by make, and I believe the model was YZF or 1 or something like that. They were streamlined and awesome looking, which was just as important to me as performance. I don't think Cheesy would agree with that assessment, but they did have tons of power and acceleration, just the way he liked his bikes. We sped along the twisting and turning coast road, snaking through the tiled roof houses and estates that never quite reached the sea. The Mediterranean always seemed to be by our side or looking over our shoulder. The scene reminded me of a Tintin adventure where he would be traveling like mad along the Mediterranean shores, chasing or being chased by bandits after some contraband. I had one of those iconic Tintin motorcycle t-shirts when I was young, and I wore it all that summer. Of course, the part of Snowy would have to be played by Cheesy. Cheesy dictated our speed and course. I did not have to pass him on the motorcycles, but I did have to keep up with him, which was no easy feat. He discounted the Tintin scenario and said he felt more like Che Guevara on his travels through Argentina. All he needed to complete the scenario was to find a cause. The more he thought about finding a cause, the faster he went. As I struggled to keep up, I wondered whether his cause would fit the epiphany I was still looking for, or would we end up as Don Quixote and Sancho Panza chasing windmills? The trip that Cheesy planned for us was a stretch of the Côte d'Azur on the French Riviera that included many of his favorite places and people. The first stop was in a small town named San Remo because there was a casino there that had a circus act as their main attraction. He told me it was actually the circus that owned the casino and that this was the best circus. I asked, "The best on the Riviera?" and he replied, "If you have to add where, then it's not the best." It turned out that the star attractions of the best circus were two of Cheesy's childhood friends, twins going by the moniker of the One-Eyed Jacks. We found the casino, parked the bikes, and headed for the front door. The attendant at the door gave Cheesy a nod and opened the door to the lobby for us. The lobby was incredibly opulent, with large Greek columns and statues of semi-naked gods at play everywhere. Lights flashed and the noise in the background grew louder as we proceeded down the hall. We were not exactly dressed for the casino, but we were heading for the circus entrance. A large poster revolved around a column in the center of an equally large room. It was three-sided and advertised their star attraction, the One-Eyed Jacks. The next frame showed the Jack of Hearts all dressed in red with fiery images flaming around him. The final frame showed the Jack of Spades. A solemn figure dressed in black and blue with white images of water and blue images of ice chilling everything around it. Again, a nod to the attendants seemed to get us through the doors to the circus arena. People were cheering and children were squealing with joy while clowns and dogs performed. The attendant walked us down to a box in front and we took our seats in a 4-person box while the stands were packed to the rafters. We no sooner sat down than the lights dimmed and the stage went to darkness. A spotlight hit a podium in the middle of the ring. 2 objects were on top of the podium. One was red, one was blue. The next spotlight was red and revealed the Jack of Hearts. The crowd went hysterical with more screaming and squealing. It was an amazing costume of red and gold with a cape and superhero boots. He milked the applause for a few moments by striking a few poses and then began to stroll towards the podium. With a flourish he snatched up the red object from the table and with a flick of his wrist it snapped in the air. There was an ear-shattering crack as the whip he was holding snapped at the air about 25 feet from where he was standing, but exactly where he was pointing with his other finger. I thought I saw a flash of fire as it cracked, but I could not be sure because it all happened so fast, and I wasn't expecting it. The Jack of Hearts then returned to the red spot on the stage. The blue spotlight appeared on the opposite side of the stage and the Jack of Spades was revealed. An equal number of screams and squeals rose from the audience. He waved to his fans and strutted towards the podium. Grabbing the blue whip, he waved his arm back in a smooth motion and snapped his wrist. The whip unfurled and snapped almost over our heads. Cheesy did not flinch, but I almost shit myself. It sounded like a rushing wave as it approached us, and I was sure I felt a drop of water land on my face as I looked up. The Jack of Spades strode back to his spotlight to cheers and applause. The spotlight on the podium grew more intense as the podium began to rise out of the floor. When it reached about 5 meters it stopped. The Jacks grew ready by snapping their whips. I had no idea what was going to happen, but the audience seemed to know what was coming and their excitement grew. The Jack of Hearts whip began to glow red like it was starting to burn and the Jack of Spades whip began to turn shades of blue and seemed to flow from the handle to the tip. Suddenly objects began to spew out of the top of the podium like a volcano. A red object and a blue object about the size of basketballs appeared in the air above the podium as the audience looked up. These were strikingly brilliant against the absolute blackness of the ceiling background. The red Jack snapped his whip and picked a red object out of the air, smashing it into millions of tiny pieces of ash that dissipated as they fell to the crowd. The crowd responded appropriately. Then the blue Jack created a waving motion with his hand and snapped his wrist at its full extension. The blue object was smashed, bursting into what appeared to be tiny droplets of water. The crowd responded appropriately. A scoreboard at the bottom of the podium kept score as the balls began to come out faster and faster and got smaller and smaller until they were no bigger than ping pong balls. The whips rang out, first fire, then water, then fire again. The scores began to mount up 10, 20, 40, 60, 90, and then 100. The whole thing was over in about 4.5 minutes of sheer frenzy by the crowd. My eyes were hurting from the spectacle the light show created and my neck was stiff from looking up. Of course, the score was 100 to 100. A convenient tie and who in the audience could debate it or even really cared. The Jacks left the stage as they had entered, to the crowd cheering and clapping. The lights went up and out came the clowns, who began tumbling and falling. Cheesy gave me the elbow and pointed to an exit. The exit led to the backstage area. A large fellow looked over at us as we went through and then smiled at Cheesy. Again, I was confused as to why people were being so accommodating to us, but I followed Cheesy through a passage of crazy circus acts, animals, and props waiting their cues. At the end of a hall we reached a closed door. He told me he wanted me to meet some twins who were childhood friends of his, so I immediately thought back to my Tintin scenario and thought, oh no. The Thompson twins. Cheesy knocked on the door. It opened a crack and a vertical slice of a face appeared. Gordon came to cheer from behind the door as it swung wide open to reveal a dressing room full of chaos behind it. I could hear the call Gordon reverberate around the room. People were running and pushing with costume pieces or makeup brushes while others were checking technical details and equipment pieces. The two Jacks were seated in huge barber-style chairs in front of large mirrors and lights everywhere. Both were being pected by a gaggle of attendants, each competing for a moment's attention to the detail they were trying to button down. Marius waved an arm in Cheesy's general direction and said something in a language I didn't recognize, but Cheesy certainly did, because a big smile came over his face and Marion laughed. Cheesy introduced me as his go-to friend when the Jacks weren't around. Both laughed. Again, the conversation turned to a foreign language, and I just tried to take in as much as I could of what was going on around me. We stayed only a few moments more before Cheesy said we had to go back to our seats for the big finish. I nodded at everyone in the room that I had made eye contact with and turned to leave through the door. Again, a cheer went up for Cheesy as we left. Traveling back through the corridor, Cheesy informed me we were going to go to a party with the Jacks after the performance tonight. We sat down in our box and waited for the final act as the clowns and dogs began to thin out. When the final clown was chased out by the final dog, the lights in the arena went dark. It was so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. About 20 feet up either side of the arena, two spotlights shone on platforms, one red and one blue, of course. The audience turned their attention upwards and then back down again as the Jacks entered the arena from opposite sides, but at the same time for this act. Their costumes included headgear and they held whips in each of their hands. The Jack of Hearts snapped one whip, then the other. They hissed and snapped into their full glory, glowing with a red fire. They extinguished as they retracted back into the grips he held in his hands. The Jack of Spades repeated the performance exactly and snapped his blue whips into action. The ceiling was a viewing screen where images could be projected from behind to dazzle the audience that looked up directly into it. Currently it was a lightning storm with amazing streaks of lightning of different colors. The Jack of Spades snapped his whips and seemed to run up the walls in a circular manner, turning almost horizontal with his feet against the wall as he moved. His whip seemed to propel him forward each time he snapped them in sequence, and he was moving higher each time. The centrifugal force seemed to be keeping his feet grounded on the walls as he ran. The Jack of Spades seemed to get faster and faster as he passed by, and the lightning cracked blue and white behind him. We kept looking up as he flew past until he reached his platform and took one knee and bent his head. The audience went totally wild. There were about 1,000 people in attendance, but that was capacity. The lightning started to flash red, and the Jack of Hearts jumped into action. It was his turn to reach his platform, and he was not to be outdone by his brother. The crowd cheered as the music and visuals began to wind them up to a frenzy. Now the audience knew what to expect, like me. I knew my neck would hurt the next day, but I still had to keep looking up. And we kept looking up as the Jack of Hearts flew past, the red and white lightning flashed, and I thought I was getting a migraine. Finally, he reached his platform and took one knee and then bent his head to strike the same pose as his brother. The audience went wild again. 2 boxes appeared on the ceiling, one in red and one in blue. They both indicated 25. I was never sure what that number meant, but to the audience it indicated how fast they were going when they reached their platforms. The 2 jacks jumped off their platforms at the same time and began moving around the top in what seemed like a chase, but who was chasing whom? As they flew past above us, we saw the Jack of Hearts followed by the Jack of Spades. The pace picked up on each lap as they flew past, snapping their whips to propel themselves around the arena. The indicators began to climb from 25 to 30 to 35. The crowd's volume and excitement climbed as the numbers climbed, and I found myself totally caught up and cheering them on to go faster and faster. When the red indicator hit 50, there was a bright flash of red fire and sparks which exploded down to just above the audience's upturned faces as they watched with amazement. Immediately after, the blue indicator hit 50 and an explosion of water produced a massive downpour of rain that evaporated just inches above the crowd's gaping faces, looking up with mouths open like baby birds waiting to be fed. There was immediate silence. The music stopped, the lights came up, and the jacks were nowhere to be seen. They had simply disappeared. The audience let out an audible gasp, and then a cheer rose up that nearly shattered my eardrums. Thankfully I was sitting down, because I would have collapsed for sure. Cheesy looked at me and said, "Are they the best circus?" And I responded, "Anywhere." I learned later that switches in the handles of the whips allowed the jacks to control the various effects they needed to complete the act. The light show and fire effects were controlled with a squeeze of the handle, and an electromagnetic clamp in the tip of the whip was used to snap on and off their marks around the top of the tent. The marks were made from rare earth elements and had some remarkable magnetic properties. The masks contained optics that allowed the jacks to see the marks, and so much more than the crowd was aware of. It even blocked out the lightning projection from the screen, so they had an unobstructed view of everything in infrared. I knew the entire ceiling was used as a rear projection screen, creating images designed to distract the viewer and add to the ambience, but I didn't know then that it had an escape hatch and could rotate without the audience's knowledge. Both jacks went through the same escape hatch, and that was why there was a small delay between the 2 explosions. Even though Cheesy explained how many of the movements were achieved, I could not help feeling that the jacks were defying the laws of physics, or at least had some magic on their side. Cheesy and I were still dressed in our gear from cycling, so we needed to acquire better clothes and get cleaned up if we were going to party with the one-eyed jacks. The boys arranged a room for us and Cheesy, and I went down to the clothing store in the lobby and got kitted out for party. Since the boys were so well known in the region, they decided to have a party in the room, and the room next door as well. The doors between the rooms were open, creating a huge space with everything that was needed for a huge party, including a stage with instruments set up. It wasn't long before carts began to arrive with enough food and drink for a Roman orgy. Seeing the guests as they arrived, it was obvious from their dress and jewelry these were the Riviera Jet Set crowd. The men all looked like versions of Errol Flynn from his swashbuckling movies, and the women hanging off their arms could all have been Bond girls. The Celtrottat family owned the casino and the circus. Casino management was not the strength of the family, so they hired Cheesy's father, Count Laszlo, to manage the casino for them. Security and surveillance were as important to the Celtrattats as they were to the Count, but for different reasons. Cheesy grew up with Marius and Marion Celtrottat, who were close to the same age as him, perhaps slightly older. Trying to keep up with their athletic skills was always a huge challenge, but the Riviera had lots of opportunities for young men to display all types of skills. Their penchant for getting into near catastrophic situations was only excelled by their desire to go again. Everyone seemed to have a story that involved one or more of the three of them in certain peril only to miraculously escape unscathed. Marius Seltrodat was known as the Jack of Hearts and Marian Seltrodat was known as the Jack of Spades. I couldn't figure out whether they chose those options because they fit their personas or if they just gave the illusion of having those personae to fit the roles. To say it was simply red versus blue or good versus evil or even two sides of the same coin would be too obvious to be real, but it sold the act. Marius was outwardly a friendly, gregarious person who always dressed in red. He had a lighter complexion than his brother and brown hair. Marian was more of an imp or scamp, and the fact that he dressed in black certainly added to that. His hair was brown, but he dyed it black to fit the role. He was charming with a glimmer of intrigue in his eye. The fan base he attracted was also a little darker than Marius or their One-Eyed Jack fans in general. Cheesy seemed to favor Marian as more of a soulmate than Marius, but that's not to say he would have traded the friendship of one for the other. People came and went at the party, but at one point or another it included circus people, local television performers, entertainers, casino bigwigs, soccer players, and even some royalty from a half-dozen different municipalities I had never heard of, and spouting titles I could only imagine were important to someone. Others at the party included friends of the Seltradats from their home country somewhere on the borders with Romania, Transylvania, and Serbia. I didn't appreciate the impact and long tradition of the circus in European and Iron Curtain countries before I met this crowd of people. As the crowd thinned out, I found myself sitting with Cheesy and the Seltradats along with some of their friends and relatives from their home in Moldavia. For my sake, and a couple others, everyone was speaking English. I was entranced by the story that was unfolding about the history of the circus and the Seltrodat family as well. The Seltrodat circus had been plying its trade for more than 800 years across Asia and parts of Europe. Marius claimed the family built a reputation for animal training and performing on the wire. Their father Tiberius and his brother Ivan were the stars of the last generation in the post-war era when the Iron Curtain still existed, and the world was divided between red and blue. The circus traveled by train to all the capitals of the Soviet world and occasionally to European cities like Berlin and even Paris on the blue side of the wall. They had trains that carried their performers, stage gear, animals, and anything else they needed to live 365 days a year on the road. Only rarely did they return to their home in Moldavia for a visit or perhaps an illness. The crowd had thinned out greatly, leaving the four of us at one table and a small group talking quietly around another table across the room. I asked Marius, how did the circus get to be so big in the Soviet world? Marius replied, the circus had its origin somewhere in the 14th century when our ancestor Cezara Seltrodat brought the Seltrodat clan together. Apparently, he was famous friends with Dragos, the first voivode of Moldavia, who reigned in the middle of the 14th century. The family began the circus and performed in all the major cities in Moldavia. He went on to say, the early circus trained animals and performed as acrobats, establishing themselves as first-class entertainers. Marian added, it was decades later that an invader named Bogdan expelled Dragos's grandson who was in charge at the time. You might think that was unfortunate for the Seltradats, but it seems the family made a new friend that day. Marius said Alan Seltrodat created the first permanent circus in Moldavia, and during this time of boom cemented the family fortunes for centuries. The family grew in size, and from that circus they began traveling to the outlying countries during times of peace and prosperity. They established powerful connections that would serve them well during times of fragile peace. I asked Marian, how do you know so much detail about your family? Because I knew nothing of mine and didn't really care that I didn't. Marian signaled to one of the people at the other table, who rose and came over. He was greeted as Uncle Sandu, even by Cheesy. Sandu Seltradat was the family historian and told me, "The family history is well documented and maintained in our library at home in Moldavia," and adding that our history goes back to the time of Ivan the Great, who became the first ruler of Moscow to adopt the title of Tsar. Marius told me that as a child he loved to hear stories from the family books. He recounted a particular story that his father would tell him. It was about one of Ivan's sons who was almost killed by assassins, but rescued by circus people. The circus provided the perfect cover for him to evade the assassins for almost a year before he and the Seltradats eliminated the assassins and returned him home safely. Uncle Sandu added, "Thankfully that was Ivan the Great and not Ivan the Terrible, because he would have probably been the assassin." Uncle Sandu verified that the story is an actual event recorded in the history of the Seltradats, which is in the form of a diary. Ivan the Great tripled his territory over his 40-year reign and built the Seltradat fortunes, including opening new lands for the circus to travel to. Ivan loved to seize lands even if they were his nephew's or his brother's lands. They were seized. After one special performance of the circus, Ivan was so amazed, he gave Darian Seltradat the land where the family home still stands today. Speaking in another language, Sandu spoke to the jacks, and I'm sure he was asking how much he should be revealing to me. I think they cleared me because he continued with more stories. The Khan Ahmed of the Golden Horde tried in vain to get tribute from Ivan the Great. They fought major battles without a finish and continued to disagree with each other. Petre Seltradat was able to get Munli Igiri, Khan of the Crimean Khanate, to become Ivan's ally against the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The complete details of the negotiations are contained in the diary and includes the acquisition of some great grimoires for the Seltradats. Uncle Sandu told us, "The Arab world had a staggering array of knowledge acquired over the centuries from Greece and both Upper and Lower Egypt. For book collectors it was a great connection." Of particular interest to Uncle Sandu were some entries made in 1488 where the Seltradats helped Ivan find people who could forge cannons or work gold and silver. Ivan required master builders in an era where those skills were incredibly hard to acquire. Matei Seltradat developed a friendship with Matthias Corvinus, who was a man who could provide many of these things. Uncle Sandu continued, and I asked, "Who was Corvinus?" Uncle Sandu replied, "I can tell you Corvinus was not a man to be trifled with because he commanded the Black Army of Hungary." Through a series of marriages, a connection was made. During this time, Corvinus built the Bibliotheca Corviniana and many documents, grimoires, and books in the Seltradat library date from that period, including the Clavicle of Solomon. These are important books covering smelting practices, alloys, alchemy, and even the occult. The Seltradats never missed an opportunity to acquire grimoires that provided unique knowledge, because over the centuries the first to possess skills were the ones to reap the biggest benefit. Marian added, "The Romanovs were also big fans of the Seltradat circus because it was wholesome family entertainment, and they would bring the circus to St. Petersburg or Moscow for festivals and even have private performances. Command royal performances." There was one particular entry about Ivan V, who ruled with Peter the Great. He went on to say, "It seems young Ivan was senile, paralyzed, and for all intents and purposes blind. Poor Ivan died before he was 30. Uncle Sandu added, "The Seltradat diary entry includes formulas for potions and herb preparations that could have caused each of the symptoms and provided details regarding exactly how he likely ingested them." Needless to say, the reign of Peter the Great was a stabilizing effect on the Seltradat pendulums of health and wealth. Uncle Sandu continued, "Peter had them search for documents for the new St. Petersburg library. Working for Peter, Cyprian Celtrodat acquired some of the most important grimoires in history on the topics of the occult, including the Malleus Maleficarum. Dacian Celtrodat was key in extracting important information that began the training of the growing Celtrodat clan. Apparently, every male Celtrodat tried to procreate as much as possible to reach a seventh son. Even if they didn't reach 7 sons, they would have built loyal family staff for their circus requirements. This was medieval Europe. Marius asked Uncle Sandu whose wedding feast had dwarfs jumping out of enormous pies and dancing on the tables. Uncle Sandu said he couldn't remember whose wedding it was, but he remembered it was in St. Petersburg and someone was killed with poison in their drinks. Uncle Sandu added, there were lots of illnesses in the next few generations like kidney disease and blood disorders. Some of the entries even record exchanges with Rasputin, the famous monk, who was looking for a solution to hemophilia B. Cheesy asked, how did they survive Stalin? And Marius told us, it was my grandfather's role in the family. Danit Celtrodat was my father's father and Matei Celtrodat was Danit's cousin. They were in charge of the family, and it was their job to ride out the revolution and Joseph Stalin. Fortunately, Stalin loved the circus and would attend the Moscow touring show quite regularly over his lifetime. The diary entries during this period are more about moving people, objects and documents through the Iron Curtain, a great trick for a magician, but the audience never applauded. Tiberius, my father and Ivan, his brother, took over after Stalin's death and during Khrushchev's time in power. They have entries for all the leaders like Brezhnev, Chernenko, and some interesting ones on Boris Yeltsin. When the wall came down, the Celtrodat family invested in the Riviera through Gordon's dad, but still have deep roots throughout the Soviet world. The Jacks era of Soviet leaders was now Vladimir Putin, but the Soviet world was a much smaller part of the bigger world. Belarus and the Ukraine may have done well, but many of the other countries' pendulums have been pushed past their pivots. Cheesy asked, is Tiberius a 7th son of his father? To which Uncle Sandu replied, Tiberius was a 7th son, but Danit, his father, was not a 7th son. That made me realize what Cheesy was asking, which of the Jacks is the February 7th? I learned that being the 7th son was an important distinction in their culture where 12 or more children were common. Sometimes it took several wives to reach 7 sons, but apparently that didn't pose much of an issue for their forefathers. Gaining a 7th son of a 7th son elevated the family to a position of great power in their culture during that time. It was believed that the power of the 7th son was incredible and could exponentially improve whatever powers they already possessed. Uncle Sandu told us that the exact birth times are a family secret that he could not divulge. It was typical for a Celtrodat son to train for the circus and specialize in a specific elemental power. If they were good enough, they may be allowed to progress through the library of magic tomes to learn the powerful knowledge they contained. Celtrodat daughters also trained in the mystical skills of divination, spells, and potions. According to Cheesy, the Celtrodat circus acquired many old magic grimoires which they kept in their library at the family home in Moldavia. As a child, he had been to Moldavia on several occasions and the libraries were massive with many of the books being purchased in Prague during the 1500s and 1600s. Marius told Cheesy their family possessed several of the most important books on elemental magic. The Celtrodat library was a private library without equal. Marion and Marius had trained since they were young to be proficient in all of the basic elemental skills. They were able to gain this knowledge from books in their library. Family connections provided training as well. The boys came to learn many of the spells, incantations, and gestures that they used in their acts to misdirect and distract their audience as well as hit all their marks. Obviously, Marius excelled in the elemental power of fire and Marion showed promise with water and lightning. They were both encouraged to progress as far as the library and family knowledge could take them. Their father, Tiberius, tutored them just as his brother Ivan tutored his children. Magic was important for both women and men in the Seltrodat family, who used it in so many activities on a daily basis. Some of the books had a more mystical aura to them and were usually advanced in skills for their day. These types of books could be traced back to people we know from history, such as the alchemist Edward Kelly, John Dee, or Roger Bacon, among others. Emperor Rudolph II purchased books from the very same vendors for his collection, which was known throughout the world. People believed in alchemy then just as they believe in chemistry today. You could find a physician, surgeon, midwife, monk, or priest who could supply you with herbs, potions, or charms to drive out sickness or demons. Uncle Sandu told us, the Aberdeen bestiary from around 1200 AD contains creatures that very few people in Europe had ever seen, and the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, was the handbook for witches known as the Hammer of the Witches. Emperors and kings believed the power to change the world could be contained within grimoires, books, manuscripts, diaries, or in fact any documents. Did one of these documents contain the plans for Archimedes' laser beam, Krishna's flying machine from the Mahabharata, or even the anti-gravity device used to build the pyramids? Many of the books from this era were written in code and required the proper cipher pages to accompany the book, or it was useless. In fact, some of the books Emperor Rudolph II purchased were reputed to be forgeries or fakes. In truth, it was probably not that difficult to pass a forgery off on Rudy Jr., who simply collected books to build the biggest library in the world and not to collect the knowledge contained within them. The Seltradats collected knowledge, and that made all the difference in the world. All of the documents in their library were authentic and their vendors remained healthy. Marius told us each book had spells that could be recited and spoken, but a spell would not work unless the caster had the appropriate level of skill within them. In most cases, these skills had to be learned through the knowledge contained in basic tomes, as well as the secrets their family disclosed to them. When they were children, Marius and Marion were required to do exercises to expand their minds, exercise their vocal transmissions, and reach physical awareness before being able to effectively use even basic skills and spells. Before the Jacks were called away to say their goodbyes, Cheesy recalled a story from his trip to Moldavia. He was sitting in the library one night reading a book, and Marius' sister Darla and her cat were just leaving. Cheesy said, "She winked at me." Marius asked, "Darla or the cat?" Cheesy went on to say he didn't think much of it because he knew Darla liked him, so he just kept on reading his book. A couple of minutes later, the cat came back into the library and jumped up on the table in front of him. He said, "I looked the cat in the eye, it winked at me, and then its eye popped out." Marius said, "He jumped up and screamed." Cheesy added that when he turned to look at the cat as he was walking away, the cat had just left a poop on the desk. Marius and Marion were doubled over with laughter and said Cheesy screamed like a little girl. Darla was just as mischievous as Cheesy and was developing enchanting powers as well as looks. That night left me intrigued with the idea of a world still hidden to most. It had a spiritual feel with a connection to the body and mind. We finished off the trip uneventfully by spending lots of time on the beach before returning to school for the final year that we would all spend together. I had hoped to meet Cheesy's family, but for some reason we didn't get around to that. It was imperative that we had enough memorable events in our last year to hold us through our transitions to new alien environments. Ian, Cheesy, Dick and I had to plan an event each that would leave our mark on the school. It had to occur in the final week, and everyone in the school had to be aware of it as it was happening. A global event, as Cheesy defined it. Ian had the advantage of soliciting his brother Richard, who brought with him his minions of righteousness, a group of unsavory individuals that were loyal to Richard only because he had something on each one of them. The school honored their students and their heritage by displaying the country flag of every student currently in attendance, as well as many other important flags to honor alumni. The idea involved replacing all the flags in the school with another flag. No matter how hard he tried, Ian could not do something mean or cruel. His idea was a flag that would make people laugh, and he had to fend off all of Lord Ratbastard's ideas and make him promise to stick to the plan. After months of consideration, he finally made his decision and placed his order online. Each day or two a package would arrive for him or Richard, and they had to hide their growing inventory. This was a big order with more than 30 very large flags to replace. Ian didn't care about the cost, but wanted to make sure none of the original flags were damaged and could be fully restored. I remember waking that morning and hearing a huge commotion going on in the hall. Opening my door just a crack, I could see people running down the hall towards the grand hall and giving a shout out to their friends as they went. I threw on my housecoat and joined the lemmings. When I entered the grand hall and looked up around the ceiling, my mouth dropped, and I started clapping. I knew right off that this was Ian's prank because every flag had an image I recognized as coming from an album cover that Ian also had a shirt of and listened to constantly. It was a reggae album cover that pictured the world cut in half at the equator, and the northern hemisphere was a giant pig consuming the southern hemisphere. The next to put their plan into action was Cheesy. To execute his plan, he was able to recruit from the rich privileged kids he had included on all those excursions we had taken over the last 4 years. They themselves were not a lot of help, but their security staff proved invaluable. Of particular interest was little Prince Albert, who had accumulated a rather sizable debt with Cheesy. Prince Albert was a little roly-poly chap about 4 feet tall and had 4 full-time security people assigned to him now. They proved invaluable redirecting people around corridors and herding them through to the reception going on in the main auditorium. The school had a great deal of artwork distributed throughout the common area. Many of the paintings were of alumni, while others were images of benefactors and prior headmasters and headmistresses. Cheesy's plan was to replace all the pictures with his own pictures. Cardboard inserts were ordered that could be pressed into the frame in seconds, and he had planned a route that would avoid all student and parent traffic thanks to Prince Albert's people. I myself was having a chat with a couple other students at the reception when I began to hear a rumble out in the hall. Some of the students began running back into the reception and pulling their friends out. The noise got louder, and I realized it was hysterical laughing. The first thing I saw when I left the reception area was the large picture in the reception hallway. Normally it was a painting of our current headmistress, Ms. Davis Smythe, but instead it was a very busty image of Wonder Woman in an action pose. Cheesy used this opportunity to mock a few of the staff that had rubbed him the wrong way. Mr. Halpern, assistant headmaster, was the Joker, and the gym teacher, Mr. Colburn, who had more chins than a Chinese phone book, was the Hulk. For his prank, Dick called upon a friend from Los Angeles who worked in the costume design department of a film studio. Dick had her design an anatomically correct rubber bodysuit of a man and another of a woman that he could strap over top of the statues that lined each side of the gardens. He ordered enough to cover all 12 of the life-sized statues. The gardens could be seen from all important venues like the dining hall and the upstairs library. Many of the dormitories had a view of the area, albeit an obscured view by stadium standards. Dick decided to execute it in the dark so no one would notice. However, to do it in the morning would leave him vulnerable to being discovered. In such a covert operation as this, Dick decided to take out the lights and do a stealth attack at night with night vision equipment. When the lights were turned back on, there would be lots of people around. The rubber suits could be slapped on the statues in seconds, and he knew each was a perfect fit. They had straps backed by Velcro, and on the actual attack each would have a tube of superglue squirted on it to hinder the removal efforts and extend the length of the prank. With 12 statues in the garden, 6 on each side, he would need 6 accomplices to cover 2 statues each in the time the lights were out. He decided to handle the lights himself so that he could get back into the crowd and observe the results and create an alibi. It was about 9:45 in the evening and the sun had disappeared behind the skyline. I was in the library returning books I found in my room that belonged to the school. It was a rush to get there before it closed for the last time, at least for me. Suddenly the lights went out and what started as panic turned to whining and complaining. I was near a chair at the window, so I just sat down and glanced out the window while letting the complainers drift away. I thought I saw something in the moonlight but dismissed it as a dog or some other small creature. When the lights came back on about 3 or 4 minutes later, I glanced out the window to see if the dog was still around. As I scanned the garden, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but had the distinct feeling that something wasn't right. Then it hit me, and I saw it. One of the statues looked abnormally fat, but when I looked closer, they were huge boobs. The statues were brilliant because the bodysuits were almost identical in color to the stone in the statues. Very few people had caught on yet, but I could see some activity in the garden. People were looking at them in obvious disgust and disapproval while others were dragging their friends down to run the gauntlet. If these were supposed to be gods, then it was evident that the gods were well endowed. I saw one young fellow running about with a stick. As he smacked the giant willies, they swung back and forth, sending him and his friends into fits of convulsive laughter. At half a meter long and thicker than the business end of a baseball bat, according to Dick, they tended to wobble back and forth many times. Finally, the bell went off and an announcement came directing all students to return to their rooms and draw their blinds. This was met with hysterical laughter, and it took almost an hour for security to herd everyone back to their rooms. By this time, the bodysuits had been cut off the statues anyway, so it made no sense, but their rage demanded it. I saved my prank for last for several reasons. Firstly, the others would be wondering whether or not I could pull something off, especially after all their amazing pranks. Secondly, I thought I could top them all and go out on a high note. As the time drew near, the pace of everything was heating up. Graduation was just a day away. Unfortunately for Ms. Davis-Smythe, she became my target. She was not my target because I disliked her or had any revenge motives, but just because she provided me with the most spectacle for my buck. Ms. Davis-Smythe was the headmistress of our school. She was chosen for her post not for her academic credentials, but rather her family connections. Again, this did not make her my target, but offered me the opportunity to use her as my foil. Ms. Davis-Smythe was methodical in her preparation of speeches for big events, and there was no bigger event on the horizon than the graduation dinner. Several other factors made her the perfect foil. English was her second language, and she could not see a thing without her glasses. She always prepared her speech with very specific wording to make herself sound as intelligent as possible, and therefore got into the habit of reading it verbatim while standing at the podium. Once her eyes looked down at the paper, she would begin reading and not look up again until she uttered the final word. I was sure she was not even listening to herself, but just in a trance-like state. The hunt for her digital copy began. I could not solicit the help of any of the others, because that would give my plan away. After digging through the school's network, I finally found her digital copy of the plan address. The goal was to let her get started and, in her trance, before I started introducing my changes. Figuring Ms. Davis-Smythe would read her speech before printing, I had to replace the hard copy after printing but before dinner. This gave me a perfect window because during that time I was scheduled to be in her office as a student liaison. The switch went off without a hitch. The hall was decorated, the tables were set, and the guests had filed in for the elegant meal that was about to be consumed. Only the graduating class and whichever of their relatives decided to attend were invited to this event. The staff was displayed at the head table like the Last Supper. Ms. Davis Smythe was cast in the role of Jesus while Mr. Halpern, who was never far from Ms. Davis Smythe, sat at her right hand. The meal was consumed, and the guests were beginning to become agitated by the trivial conversation they had been subjected to over the last hour when Mr. Halpern approached the podium and tapped the microphone. After welcoming everyone, except the cooks and dishwashers, and licking as many boots as he could in the time he had, he began his introduction of Ms. Davis Smythe. It was a work of literary genius equaling the likes of Rudyard Kipling. I was beginning to suffer pangs of regret for what was about to happen as Mr. Halpern showered Ms. Davis Smythe with inflated skills and achievements, lifting them to a stratospheric level few Nobel laureates ever reach. The crash was going to create a sonic boom. Ms. Davis Smythe stood at the podium and adjusted her outfit, then wet her lips and pulled up the chain on her glasses as she slipped them onto her nose. Immediately her face changed as she squinted and shook her head slowly from side to side. It seemed that someone had applied a thin coating of Vaseline to her lenses. I can confirm the brand. After struggling with different solutions, she eventually cleaned her lenses, with the assistance of Mr. Halpern. She cleared her throat and opened the folder on the pedestal. Graduating class, honored parents, and esteemed staff, welcome to this year's graduation dinner. We are here tonight to review the sad and disappointing year of these undeserving parasites and idiots you call your children. Immediately a huge gasp went out from the audience. Seconds passed before parents jumped out of their seats and started hurling abuses at Ms. Davis Smythe, the staff, and even some of the students. One parent shouted, "I told you you were a parasite." It took Ms. Davis Smythe a few seconds to grasp what had just happened, and it made her weak in the knees. I thought she was going down, but Mr. Halpern was up and out of his chair in a flash to run to her aid. Unable to continue, Mr. Halpern passed her off to an assistant that led her back to her chair. He then returned to the podium to take charge and looked over the speech. Scanning the document, he felt that it was just a clerical error, and he could continue on. He successfully navigated through several pages of the script and was feeling confident as he approached the end. You could hear the confidence in his voice increasing as he spoke and gaining force with every achievement made this year. Then the second to last line came out of his mouth, "Let's stand to salute this year's crop of losers and failures." People looked at each other in disbelief before the second wave of hostility took hold. It was turned into a tsunami as it slammed against the stage, and both Mr. Halpern and Ms. Davis Smythe had to vacate the area as quickly as possible. I glanced at Ian, Cheesy, and Dick, and they all knew exactly what was going on. Cheesy and Dick gave me knowing signs that looked like approval, but Ian was less enthralled with the prank. I think he could see the fallout coming. I was beginning to develop a pit in my stomach about my prank and what could happen, but I knew getting caught was not an option. The board of directors would have to do something about this year's pranks. There had never been such a series of events at this school in their storied history. They were sure to get pressure from their clientele, who would be upset with the exposure to life their protégés experienced this year. It didn't do the alumni any favors either. A friend, still at school, wrote me later that Ms. Davis Smythe and Mr. Halpern were given retirement packages by the board of directors of the school. They were married in Zurich and now run a small hotel resort on Lake Geneva. I'm sure they had many important guests in the years that followed. Would they have ended up retired separately if not for these events? Was this a good thing that resulted from a bad beginning? Who knows? I do know it made me feel horrible about myself regardless of the results, and I think at that point I decided to include something from that experience in my epiphany, whatever that would be. Do no harm to others. Not like a doctor does no harm, but something different like a helpful do no harm while doing some good. Well, it still needed work, but I had the start of an idea. My graduation present to myself was that I managed to get an invite to Ian's estate in Kenya this summer, and the even better news was that Lord Ratbastard wouldn't be there. Apparently, he was the victim of a practical joke executed by a couple of devious twins from our sister academy near our alma mater. Richard was observed stark naked on the school roof in full view of all in the dining hall as he tried to sneak past the skylight. The chant of Little Dick could be felt rocking the hall and reverberating throughout the school. Richard claimed it was a religious ceremony he was researching for a paper that was totally misunderstood. 2 nuns were required to assist him, and he was simply changing into the appropriate robe. Of course, the nuns could never be found, but I heard their habits were hanging in a closet in an academy near our own. When asked to produce the robe, he claimed it had blown off the roof in the wind. Richard spent a week pretending to look for it to no avail. Even his minions helped him look for it with no success. Pulling pranks on the boys in our school was a sporting event with an annual championship at our sister academy. I had heard of the twins who played the part of the nuns before, but they were just in 3rd year. They were known as the Toxic Twins because of their names, something we could identify with. Let me introduce Heidi and Holly Toxic, aka the Toxic Twins. Their parents were in show business in the United States, so who knows what their real names would have been. Their father, a comedian known as the Poison Mouth with the vile tongue, Hylia Toxic, was on all the late night shows. Their mother was a solo artist of some minor distinction who was always pictured with her nose in the air and a poodle under her arm. The real connection to the money was through the father, who had several other offspring from an assortment of liaisons of various lengths. Heidi and Holly, however, were known to be his special girls, his toxic twins. Lord Ratbastard claimed they were usually called Heidi, and the Ho Richard had a personal dislike for Holly due to the role she played in his entrapment, but claimed it was due to her known promiscuity. At that point, he usually thumped on the table with his fist and screwed up his face in that unclergy way of his. Perhaps he will be working on that face at the monastery where he is spending his summer. It was time for us all to say farewell to each other and embark on our separate journeys. Ian was off to McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada to study medicine. His plan was to accelerate his learning so that he could advance as quickly and as far as possible in the next few years. This was a great location for him because it was a Commonwealth country with a great education system, healthcare, and was relatively safe. The school also had a hospital, so he could shave time off his experience commitments. Not far away was Upper Canada College, a prep school frequented by royals and deemed a safe haven. Many of his cousins attended that school. Cheesy had decided to go to MIT at Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the United States to study computer science. He figured with his logical brain he could develop AI that could counteract any offense and then break down any defense. I thought at the time it was funny that this would be his position, defense before offense. Cheesy seemed more the type that figured his offense was unbeatable, so why bother with a defense? The wild call of Cambridge, USA reached out to him, and he was looking forward to bunking in the dormitory and roughing it a bit. A little American-style culture was called for since he had spent all his life in Europe. Adventure was on the horizon for Cheesy. Dick had just turned 17, so as soon as graduation was over, he was off to enter West Point. He met all the requirements, some of which I thought were slightly archaic for the age. The cadet must be unmarried, not pregnant, and not under obligation to support any children. If avoiding the draft were only that easy. He had above average marks and scored 1200 plus on the SAT, so the academic requirements were not much of a concern. I doubt very much that any other cadet was in as good physical shape as Dick. I myself wanted to explore genomes and the genetics of microorganisms, plants, and animals. It was the structure and function of all cells that not only determined life in the past, but also the present and will again in the future. Discovering how advances in molecular and cellular biology could be applied to things like gene therapy and genetic testing opens up so many possibilities. Perhaps I could develop crops to feed the hungry or rid the world of pests to make the world safer for all. I heard about CRISPR that somehow allowed DNA manipulation, but to reach that level was going to be a journey. Although Harvard and MIT were the best schools in the world for molecular biology, I didn't want to live in the United States, so I chose the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, north of London, and had no problems being accepted. This did, however, require a call to Carl, a fellow who worked for my Uncle David and managed my trust money for me. Carl was an honest fellow that I trusted, and he financed whatever it was that I needed financed over the years. In this case, I gave him the details of the university and he agreed to take care of it. He also suggested that I stay in residence for the first year before finding other accommodations. That seemed like an acceptable idea to me since I knew nothing about the day-to-day running of a household, and I wanted to focus on school anyway. It was not the adventure I was looking for, so I left that task to Cheesy. When I look at the pendulums of the world, for the Soviet Union it has swung so far in one direction it can never reach equilibrium again. There are not enough people who care to push back to provide resistance to the crumbling political structure. While some of the citizens managed to get off the pendulum when it was flying high, many were left to finally release their hold as they were flung off the other side where governments failed, became corrupted, or let their country's infrastructure decay. History has shown that communism requires a revolution to gain its initial control and to establish its parameters. The freedom fighters of any glorious revolution are generally just victorious terrorists. Although there were many fathers of the Soviet Revolution like Lenin and Marx, it was unfortunately Stalin who picked up the ball and ran with implementing it. Until all the terrorists' freedom fighters are culled from the system and true believers of socialism are put in charge, there will never be an equilibrium with this version of communism. Those who could influence the pendulum of the Soviet Union didn't see any equilibrium in its future and abandoned it. It's far easier to create a new society where the pendulum can be reset with a strong equilibrium, albeit a subset of the larger. Perhaps it will take the conversion of a highly socialistic society believing they are taking a step toward enlightenment to create the perfect society for all. They may willingly change their democratic socialist structure to become the enlightened society. How long would a society like that have to last for us to call it successful? 1,000 years? Perhaps the new China can undo the atrocities of Mao Zedong, or the new Cuba post-embargo will vindicate their political structures. Those are not pendulums I can impact. Cheesy Ian, Dick and I agreed to meet every summer for our vacations. Then we left Ridgeway for the last time and went to follow our own paths to different destinations around the world.